Welcome, everyone, officially to Why Don't Publishers Fact Check Their Books? And Should They? My name is Jane Friedman. I am the editor and the publisher of the Bottom Line newsletter, which covers trends and news for an audience of authors and other industry professionals. Today, I have with me Doug Seibold, who is the publisher of Agate, which is in the Chicago area, who reached out to me shortly after I wrote about this issue, and Ann Kjellberg, who is a book critic and has worked in magazines, has worked in books, and to my mind, knows a lot of things about a lot of different media areas. So, welcome to the both of you. Thank you for joining me today. Before I open up the discussion, I just want to offer the briefest summary of the Salt Path for those who aren't familiar with the book or the character and the plot. It is published under a name that is not the author's. Well, I don't know if that's her legal name now, but it's not the name that she's always had. And a newspaper went digging into her background, into her life, and found that she misrepresented the circumstances under which she and her husband lost her house. It was due to criminal acts. She embezzled from her employer. That was not divulged in the book. And there's also some questions around the health of her husband. So in the book, they go on this long walkabout, and it helps with his health. He has this condition that can't be cured, and and excuse me, and the walking helps, and he's been dealing with this condition now for quite some time. And people have questions about whether they're being truthful about his condition because other people have not had such a good outcome. So the author has defended herself. I'll put some of those links into the chat for those who might want to see her defense. The publisher, which is a big one, Penguin, Michael Joseph in the UK, which is owned by Penguin Random House, they said that they did their due diligence, but they haven't been terribly forthcoming with a lot of information about this, but they have delayed the next book by the author. So, where I wanted to start, especially since I don't necessarily think it's widely known, I wanted to start with a discussion of fact checking when it happens in the newspaper and the magazine environment, because there is, I think, what I expressed in my newsletter about this is that every time there's an issue like this, a scandal like this, people are surprised, both the general public and people in newspaper and magazine media, they're surprised that book publishers don't fact check. And so it's kind of like this, we end up having the same conversation again and again and again about why it doesn't happen, and aren't book publishers embarrassed that they haven't been fact checking their books. And uh, so all that to say, let's talk about why there's this expectation of fact checking and how it's happened in newspapers and magazines, and then we can kind of segue into how it happens or not in books. And Doug, we'll start with you, and then Anne, we'll have you jump in as appropriate. Doug?
Well, I think, first of all, when we talk about fact checking, I think, there's always that question of what exactly do people mean when they're saying that. And I think it comprehends a couple of different kinds of activities that different kinds of publishers do with the work that they publish. Um, and I think that what people are talking about in the case of Raynor Winn in particular is they're talking about what's effectively fraud. They're an author who sort of misrepresented herself to the world, but probably first and foremost to her publisher. And that happens every now and again. That's something that sort of recurs. Sometimes it happens in memoir, other times it happens in other kinds of nonfiction. And I certainly think publishers should take steps to make certain that the work that they're publishing is, reputable. That it's not intentionally set out to sort of deceive readers or anything else like that. But I think a lot of times people are confusing that a little bit with the traditional kind of fact checking that magazine publishers did in, like, say, the second half of the 20th century, which had to do with sort of internal kind of reporting and editorial practice, oftentimes with work that was done by staff writers or by work for hire writers, for work that was oftentimes copyrighted by the magazine itself and for which they had full legal responsibility. And I hope one thing we can talk about more as our conversation goes on is about the very, very different kind of business relationships, legal relationships between writers for periodicals and writers for books, for most books.
Well, let's talk about that. But before we do, Anne, do you have any perspective to add from where you sit?
Yeah, no, I think Doug has set it up very well. There are a lot of different practices within both within the magazine world around what people would consider fact checking, but it it's not necessarily guaranteed to prevent against somebody bamboozling you or is intentionally deceiving you. And of course, there are famous instances of journalists also lying and getting away with it for years and years.
Do you want to mention one?
Oh, well,
I
Charles Glass is the most famous. He worked at the New Republic, and he had a movie made out of his like long run of deceptive journalism work.
yeah.
Janet Cook at the Washington Post.
Jason Blair
Um,
at the
yeah,
time.
Clifford Irving and his largely fabricated biography of Howard Hughes is going back like 50 years now. I mean, these convulsions, as you indicated, Jane, they recur, decade by decade. Although in a larger picture of, quarter of a million to half a million new books coming out every year, relatively few get this kind of high profile kind of airing out.
Mhm.
But maybe it's a cockroach like situation where, you see one on the counter and how many untold thousands are sort of, behind the floorboards or something like that, which I think is a serious question for publishing. Like, what is the credibility of the overall enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, this may just be the horrible cynic in me, and I've spent too long in the industry, but I assume that there is a lot of this going on that we never uncover, and it's these bestsellers that become movies, as in this case, that then leads people to kind of digging into the weeds. Did this really happen? Is this really true? It doesn't seem like it. It seems too good to be true, and then we find out
The
it's not.
people involved themselves come forward and say, I was a participant in this and it can go this way. And a lot of that comes out of just envy that someone is making a lot of money off a
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the legal differences because I do think this is quite important. And also, really, it's a great education for authors to understand what they're on the hook for, what the publisher's on the hook for, and the differences. Doug, do you want
Yeah.
to get into that?
Yeah. I would love to, Jane. So one of the things that I think when I'm talking to my students here at our Agate Publishing Academy or to the interns that we're training, we use this illustration to sort of distinguish, um, what I'm going to describe further about this legal relationship is that when you got a magazine, right, the name of the magazine is big, and then the name of the writers in the magazine are little. And then when you have, a book, you know, the name of the author is big, and then the name of the publisher is little. So what this means, when you're talking about books, the legal relationship with the public publishing of most books is effectively a partnership between the author who owns and controls the copyright and the publisher to whom the copyright is licensed, to actually produce the physical book and sell the physical book. And then effectively, the sale of the book results in a revenue share between the author and the publisher. In a traditional magazine situation, you have a very different structure where the magazine is completely dominant, or the newspaper or whomever it is. Oftentimes, most of the people who create the content that appears in the magazine are staffers who work for the magazine, or they are freelancers who are producing work for the magazine as work for hire. They get paid their fee and then they are done and they are out. And all of the legal responsibility for the content of the magazine is assumed by the magazine itself. So they have a different legal stake in terms of their like culpability or responsibility for the material that they publish. With books, it is more complicated. Ultimately, most book author contracts put the responsibility for the contents of the book on the author, and they make some very substantial warrants and indemnifications to the publisher that effectively promise the publisher all manner of things about the veracity, accuracy, and legitimacy of the contents of the book that they're asking the publisher to publish. And they hold the bag in terms of that legal responsibility. That's a technical term.
Yeah. That's the key issue that I think so many people don't understand when we get into these people throwing up their arms, like how could publishers be so irresponsible, not even to check the facts? The relationship begins with a promise on the part of the author that they are taking responsibility for the truth of the work. And there's no contract like that with a journalist for a piece.
And in terms of the what this means as far as the interpersonal or professional dynamic between the writer and the publisher, when you're talking about periodical publishing, you're talking about a very cut and dried, power structure and authority structure. And regardless of how the author might feel about her work, the publisher is going to say, like, effectively, we're double checking you, and we're requiring you to submit to this process in part because we can force it upon you because you're working for us. Some writers might chafe at that. Others might feel like, great, back me up. I like that. With a book publishing arrangement where it is more of essentially a partnership structure, although, obviously many book publishers are very, very big corporations. Many authors are not big in terms of their financial wherewithal or their clout in terms of this relationship. But there's a presumption of goodwill there and a presumption in signing the contract that the author has a degree of credibility and professionalism that the publisher has to respect. And you can really compromise that relationship if you are presuming kind of any lack of responsibility or any lack of authority on the part of the writer. And you could breed an adversarial relationship that is not really what it is you want to have in that professional relationship. You want to have that be more collegial and more mutually respectful.
So I'd like to discuss next for book publishers, they do go through an editorial process that I would consider thorough at most established publishers, where there's acquisitions or a development editor who's going through, and then typically there's a copy editor, could be internal, could be a freelancer, and then typically some proofreading. So, and earlier before we went live, you mentioned that there's kind of sometimes this fuzzy line between copy editing and fact checking. And certainly when I was working at a traditional house, when I sent things out for copy edit to a freelancer, I did ask them to perform some what I would call light fact checking. Now, I don't think it was anything that was going to uncover fraud necessarily, but it certainly it was always a red flag to me when the copy editor came back with all sorts of things that were, let's say, questionable or could be claims that could be disproven. But anyway, I'm talking too much. Could you elaborate on the fuzzy line here?
I think that most people would regard copy editing as including checking of accessible facts like dates, the spelling of people's names. If you say that a thing happened in a certain place historically, and you can establish, using an encyclopedia or something that had happened there, that's a part of copy editing. And even in magazines, a few of people I've talked to, they say that what we were talking about as fact checking is done by the copy desk.
Mhm.
So it's layered into that process of just making sure that everything, that there aren't mistakes. where it starts to hedge into something grayer is when I think, and maybe we're going to talk about this a little bit further on, in magazines and journalism, where they go beyond what's accessible public information and start to kind of re-research the piece in order to be able to, kind of like in science, can you perform the experiment again?
Yeah.
To confirm that all of this happened in this way, and that these people existed, and that there's this famous book. I don't know. Maybe we should definitely, if we're running down the bibliography of fact checking, we should talk about it. Called let's see, I wrote down what it's called. Lifespan of a fact, which is this basically this argument between a copy editor, and I think it's the Believer, and this author who did just make up a lot of things and say, I wanted to use the word purple because it sounded better than pink. And so the process of going out into the world and seeing if these things that are not part of the public record really happened, that I think it's hard for me to imagine that being done in a book setting.
Yeah.
But what publishers do, and I think Doug was sort of getting at this, is that they have I think when people say, why don't book publishers fact check, they sound like this is a service they're supposed to perform for the reader. But they do a service for themselves, which is protecting themselves from liability and from reputational damage. So, like, to me, it's unimaginable that this giant publisher could have published a book by someone who was operating under a different name. I mean, they must have known, and that apparently had like a warrant out. I mean, surely you might have, and that what they refer to as due diligence might have included discovering that your crimes had actually been committed by your author. So you want to make sure that your writer is who they say they are, and kind of depending on where you are on the spectrum of things, there's a sort of reputational issue. If you're Knopf, you're expected to hold to a certain standard, and so they're doing these things to protect themselves. But they don't feel enough. It's not a part of the role of the publisher to serve the reader with a thorough rehashing of the work of developing the book.
Well, and then that raises questions of, how does the author feel about that? Does the author feel that they are being accused or being doubted, by their publisher in this context? I think that it's interesting talking about that book, The Lifespan of a Fact. That we had a whole convulsion, I would say, in the 2000s and the teens about memoir and about how we looked at memoir in terms of its uh, factitious or non-factitious nature, and obviously there were a lot of memoirists that said, "Hey, it should be my lookout to determine, what of this I want to characterize as fact or not." But I think readers kind of pushed back on that, and you saw some pretty high-profile contortions on the part of writers like Augustin Burroughs or David Sedaris, really, really successful and popular memoirists, who effectively acknowledged that they would manipulate these stories, to make them more entertaining or more readable. And, that's very much where I think that lifespan of a fact story comes out. But this is very distinct, I think, from, these questions of more researched or more reported type material and the veracity of that kind of stuff, and how that is checkable at the scale at which books appear. A typical magazine article might be 5,000 words long. A typical book might be 90 or 100,000 words long. There's an economic issue in there about like what is actually feasible to do that kind of work, to sort of check on that kind of reporting. And I think I'd also like to raise the fact that different kinds of publishing have different ways of dealing with this as well. Newspaper publishing, most of this traditionally falls to the individual reporter, more so than to other editorial staff, working there who are, the reporter is responsible to, but they're saying, go back, go back, go back. They're not necessarily sending multiple people in there to re-report this stuff, especially if there are sensitive sources that reporter is trying to protect. So you have this whole tradition in newspaper writing of, essentially a reporter working with a source that they are intentionally keeping unknown to their employer, let
Mhm.
alone to everybody else. So that raises all kinds of questions about how you fact check a situation like that. Meanwhile, in academic publishing, you have, this intense depth of research that these scholars are doing that oftentimes will unfold over a period of years and years and years. And you cannot send somebody else into the stacks to sort of replicate that. They have a whole other process by which they vet, the veracity or the quality of the scholarship, which is peer review. And sometimes that happens pre-publication, but certainly not to the depth of a full-on, fact check as some people might think about it from these fact-checking memoirs or novels about the New Yorker, and sometimes after publication, where when people are reviewing people's scholarship, they're coming in, with the long knives and saying, well, I know this about this and this about that, and I take issue with this, and I'm not sure this is 100% accurate. Nobody is really getting too worked up about that because it's understood as part of the process of scholarship that there is this checking process that unfolds, as part of the scholarly enterprise.
I want to circle back to something we kind of steered around the costs. Because I mean, part of this is the economic issue of fact checking your average 80,000 word book. The costs they spiral very quickly, but I don't think most writers understand what the costs of fact checking might entail. So I know from when I worked in at a at the Virginia Quarterly Review because we sent everything out for fact checking. So I can speak to those figures, but I'm wondering if either of you can speak to what you've seen in terms of costs.
Hmm. Um, I don't have an answer to that question. I worked for a very long time at the New York Review of Books, and we did not do it. We were reviewing books, and the book itself was the fact. And
Hmm.
we checked the quotes and we made sure that the book did say what the reviewer said that it said. We did have reported pieces, and the proofreading department would check them in the sort of copy editing way that I spoke of, but not call sources and do that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
So you weren't fact-checking Joan Didion there at the New York Review
No, we
that
were
time.
we were not. And that's the other thing. In a sense, it was you know, there is an element of this that looks back to what you were speaking about before about the kind of collegial relationship with the writers. We weren't vetting sentence to sentence, but there's a very high bar for getting in the first place. Like people are only writing. We're only writing for the review after Bob Silvers or Barbara Epstein had been following their work for many years and they had a well-established reputation, and their peers, they would always go to other historians and say, what do you think of this historian? So once you had established that relationship, then a fair amount rested with the faith in the writer. Um, and you trusted Joan Didion to be doing her stuff, but
Yeah.
also they published Norman Mailer too, who wasn't always strictly
Yeah. Yeah.
level. But I do know, like, it is, I think, one of the lower paid positions. So it's a job that you get kind of right out of journalism school. So whether or not this thing that we're calling fact checking, you kind of check that box, but whether you have a person who's really in a position to follow up on work that's very sophisticated, or work by somebody who's been in the field for a very long time and has a detailed knowledge of a certain country or a certain corporation. Maybe you can say that you check the facts, but you haven't really done it. And I at this point too, I mean, the two famous cases of big fact checking departments with Time magazine, which I guess established it in the 40s or the 50s or something, when they really built up that operation, and they were kind of a garden for serious nonfiction writing. And the New Yorker, most infamously, that had a fact-checking department that people in other magazines considered basically a kind of a fetishistic enterprise. Like
Yeah.
um, These were huge generators of wealth in their time, and they had an enormous revenues from advertising. And then, like by the time I was around, the New Yorker was well understood to be basically subsidized by Condé Nast. That the costs of running that magazine were not met by subscribers. And at this point, we're nowhere near having that kind of wealth in magazine publishing. And um, the idea that you could employ a whole department full of people all day long, kind of re-researching the pieces, is just phantasmal. And I do think that we're heading toward an environment, with more sort of creator-driven stuff, where, a lot of little operations on Substack like us, and people are able to, everybody kind of celebrates the disappearance of the gatekeeper. That there's just going to be fewer and fewer resources for this sort of work, and there's less and less agreement about what fact checking is. Like Facebook famously got rid of, that's a different kind of fact checking, but instituted fact checking, kind of autonomous fact checking after the 2016 election and the scandals around that. But then there was conservative backlash that the quote unquote fact checking wasn't sufficiently neutral, and they got rid of the fact checking. So now it's kind of up to you. Everybody their own facts.
Well, but I think that thank you for raising the G word, gatekeeper. And because I do think this is a little bit of a be careful what you wish for kind of thing. Some of the folks in the media who've really cast aspersions on book publishing for not doing fact checking the way late 20th century magazines kind of defined it, are I think coming from a very blinkered view of a certain kind of publishing that's really an artifact now, which I think Anne was kind of indicating that, in the mid to late 20th century, some of these magazine businesses were enormously profitable. And they made most of that money by selling advertising. And what they were selling to their advertisers were these huge circulations. And they achieved these huge circulations in part because of the respect that they commanded for the quality of the news and information that they were supplying. So fact checking was a way to bolster that. It was a way to sort of bulletproof that. And you were able to afford it past tense because of these huge floods of advertising revenue that your industry commanded at a period in time that is increasingly receding into the distance. I think part of the question is, can anybody afford that fact checking anymore? And I think the answer is no. So there's a little bit more of this kind of caveat emptor situation with readers, but at the same time, we've had this clamoring to sort of tear down the gatekeepers. Part of that implies this idea that people should be free to put out into the world whatever information they would like to, and then let that compete in this sort of, quote unquote, free market of ideas, or of information to determine whether or not there's anything out there that, people are putting out that is poor. I'm not crazy about this world either. I kind of liked, a world where there were more formalized structures for ensuring the quality and veracity of information. I also preferred that business model as a publisher, to what we have now, which is essentially seeing a lot of the money from information that people create and go out and put out onto the internet in one form or another, going to these huge tech companies, that are essentially are profiting on the flow of traffic. Yeah, and these are the folks right now that are kind of like, yeah, we don't really need this fact checking thing anymore. So there is a real, I think, crosswind of sort of competing interests here and confusion around, what is really going on. And we haven't even talked about plagiarism and that whole aspect of things because, some I think one of the things about the internet is it made plagiarism easier than it ever been before, but it also made finding plagiarism much, much easier than it ever been before. So I think that's one reason why over the past 30 years, we've had so many, really, really embarrassing high profile revelations of plagiarism in the work of some, incredibly esteemed academic historians and writers. I mean, my favorite is when a woman who's the vice president of, Norton Publishing was found to have lifted whole passages of work from Wikipedia that
Well,
appeared in her book. Because it not only was it plagiarized, but it was really badly plagiarized at the same time. So there's a lot going on there.
Indeed. So for those who don't know about the costs of fact checking, I'll just throw out some figures. When I was at VQR, now granted, this was like 12, 13 years ago, um, we actually paid on some pieces, we paid the fact checkers more than we
well,
paid the writer. So the writers generally earned about 30 cents a word, somewhere around that. And the fact checkers, could spend hours and their hourly rate would end up being more than what the writer was paid. So thousands upon thousands of dollars. I think it would be in the five figures for a book, but
I'll bet
lots
the
of,
writers didn't know that, Jane.
whew, I guess, oh, gosh, if they didn't know it, well, they should.
What they didn't know didn't hurt them, right? Yeah.
well, one of my writers, Hugh Aiken, wrote about the lack of fact checking in podcasts. We now have all these oral forms that are spontaneous and they don't undergo anything like the kind of review that written work used to, even like copy edit. And lots of kind of loose facts are ricochet around. But then there was this famous incident when This American Life I can't remember where they sued because of a report on Apple manufacturing. So they introduced a layer of fact checking at This American Life. And I'm kind of like, where is the money coming from for
Mm.
this?
So here's an interesting comment from Beth. She says, to me, the loss of gatekeepers in social media and the rise of AI generated content with errors, and this is, in fact, an argument for having fact checking in publishing. And as trust in online information begins to erode, people will turn to print sources as more trustworthy. Although, I hesitate to say that print ought to be more trustworthy, but do you have any response?
No, I think I do think that there is a place for fact checking. The question is who's going to pay for it? And traditionally in book publishing, this was something that if an author was concerned and wanted to backstop what they were doing, is that they would use some of their advance money to get somebody to sort of back check them or something like that. And again, traditionally in magazines, this was something that the magazine paid for. Um, but again, are you talking about reporting, or are you talking about fraud, or are you talking about plagiarism? There's a lot of different things that can go wrong and do go wrong in terms of the accuracy or the quality of information. And so it's a matter of, I think, figuring out the best way to apply these techniques in the right situations. So I look at as a book publisher, I'm concerned about fraud. I certainly want to find out if I feel a writer that I'm going to work with is deceiving me or is trying to deceive readers. I look at that as my responsibility. And we also check plagiarism. And we also do the kind of things that Ann was talking about. We call it when we're in the editing process, we call it creating a style sheet, where essentially every proper name, every place, pretty much as Ann said, any available fact, we check as part of editing. But when you're talking about reporting, it gets into, for all the reasons we've been discussing, it gets a lot more complicated in terms of figuring out who bears that cost and who bears that responsibility.
So, to play devil's advocate for a moment, let's say because of costs, it is certainly not feasible for publishers to hire a fact checker for every single book. Um, but what if we're just focusing on key claims in the book, the things that would be most important that we verify this actually happened the way the author said it did? Which might mean checking court records or property records, like some of the things that was it the Observer, I think the UK Observer did when they found out that Raynor Winn was not telling the truth.
Well, I think that that case they should have figured that out because of the criminal record. I think
Yeah.
like that one seems to have been a really rare lapse. But
Mm.
I don't think that you can, with every memoir writer, make sure that their life happened the way that they said it did. Um, I think that's not where the worrying thing is now. The worrying
Right.
thing is how we are going to create institutions that can do the work that it takes to
Mm.
create established history. You know,
I think what you're talking about, Jane, I think you use the term key facts of a work. One of the things that we always say at Agate, you know, again to our students or to our interns or anybody else we're talking to publishing about is that the most important decision you make in publishing a book is at acquisitions.
Mhm.
You want to determine certain things right when you're thinking about signing a book up. So if you're having an author come to you and say, I'm going to do this book, it's going to say these things, and it's going to be, important and meaningful or sensational and of huge interest or whatever, you really want to vet those things at that point. You really want to be sure, that you've got, those ducks in a row. And you want to be sure before you sign a contract with that author that you have faith in what they're doing. And so to a certain extent, you might want to say, show us some, substance of proof or something like that. Let us know where you're coming from. But I can't underestimate the fact that, again, you're forming a partnership with a writer in this context. And if you are, and again, if you're a magazine, you can just tell that writer, you work for us and you're going to go through this process and that's how it's going to go. And we're going to treat you this way and we're going to treat your work this way. It's a little bit more difficult with that, a little bit more complicated when you're talking about a book author. If you're essentially saying, hey, we doubt what you brought us, even though we signed you up, even though we said we wanted to do this book with you, we don't we trust you, but we're going to verify, I think is what Reagan described it so memorably about nuclear arms testing. So it's complicated.
Yeah.
We have done some really small bore fact checking of this kind at Agate in certain situations where we felt like, especially if an author was like, I really want to get another pair of eyes on this, oftentimes thinking about things that had to do with how they were framing things, like a journalist writing maybe about some specialized kind of information or something like that. But I've come to feel like even in those cases, if an author wants to get some authority to backstop how they've characterized what other authorities have already told them, which is what reporting is, then knock yourself out. Go ahead, ask somebody, read your quotes to them and say, does this sound right or correct? As opposed to we're gonna, send somebody through this, with a thresher,
Mm.
to kind of ensure that everything is, to a degree of correctness that we as an institution are going to uphold, which again is different with books because we're not a magazine or journal that has a reputation or that has a process for providing information to the world. We're a vehicle for bringing the work of writers
Mhm.
to the world. And it's just a different kind of relationship.
And you can imagine you could try to create some sort of routine vetting. You say, we ask this of everyone in order to avoid situations in which we are misled, like send us your birth certificate or something. But the determined malefactor could get around those things. And it's already a very small number of people who actually do this.
Okay, so I'm going to throw out another devil's advocate question. We know that publishers already routinely pay lawyers to do legal review of books, especially, in any sort of situation where a memoirist might potentially libel or defame someone in the book, and sometimes edits are made to kind of avoid the risk of lawsuit. So why not invest similarly in factual accuracy?
I think with a legal review, Jane, you're usually talking about something that again is small bore and it might have to do with a couple of particularly sensitive situations or representations in the book. And but if we're doing that, we might oftentimes tell an author to do that as well. It's like, here's what our lawyer says, but what does your lawyer say? Because again, in the contract that we have, our authors make representations and warrants to us about the information in their work. And if we say our lawyer is concerned about this, what's to stop them from saying, and in fact, I would fully expect, many writers to say, well, I stand behind my reporting and I think this is perfectly fine.
Mhm.
One of the places where push comes to shove with this is about liability insurance and things like that. Like many writers are saying like, are you going to cover me in case I'm a subject of a libel suit or any other action brought against me? Um, there's actually a long and fascinating history behind how that process works, which might be a little out of scope of this conversation today. But it's something that sort of evolved, like a lot of things in publishing practice, that's evolved over decades, probably over the past century, in terms of different things that happened in particular ways by which authors responded in this way, publishers responded in that way. Um, but I, we have limited authority to change a writer's work, right? So we can tell them like, well, we're going to resist this, but oftentimes the writer can say, well, if you're not going to do it how I brought it to you, then this contract is done. But at the same time, if they don't do what we want them to do, we can certainly hold things up. And there might be clauses in contracts from big publishers. Certainly there's clauses that can give them, kind of an ejection seat to authors, kind of like what happened with Milo Yiannopoulos,
Mhm.
you know, um, with his book with Simon and Schuster a couple of years ago, or other publishing events where, authors got into some kind of public trouble and their publisher took their book out of print, and effectively buried it.
Yeah, I think they call
A lot of
those
this might have to do with they might have
mo-
to do with the power structure of these relationships.
I think they're called morality clauses.
Mhm.
When the author gets into that public trouble and the publisher realizes this is going to tank the market for the book, and so they have that eject button for themselves if things
We
don't.
don't actually have those at Agate, and I don't know what the case is for other independent publishers of our scale that way. But yeah, I could see the big companies having something like that. Again, the shifting dynamic, writer and publisher there, no writer is going to want to see their book disappeared because
Mhm.
of a morality clause.
Yeah.
So, but does that better serve the public or the readership or the reputation of the publisher?
Yeah, I know agents do not like those clauses and
They do not.
they try to get them struck every time, but I don't know how successful they are. Um,
Just thinking as a hypothetical, like a legal check is probably expensive because lawyers are expensive. And you could probably pay, a young person starting out the cost of a legal check to go around, wherever those people were in Wales or whatever, and see whether that inn is really on that promontory. And I just can't convince myself that that's desirable. Do you really need to do that with every book that's published to have someone it's a little bit of what Doug was saying before about the size of the author versus the size of the publisher on the
yeah.
on the spine. This person is presenting their work, and you, the reader, are the person who judges uh, how seriously to take it.
Yeah. Okay, we can't have any publishing conversation without injecting AI into it. Um, we have some people wondering, you know, about whether AI can do some of the fact checking, even if it's not as reliable as a real person. Um, I have certainly heard about both authors and publishers of all sorts of materials using AI for fact checking. I even heard an author with Johns Hopkins talking about his use of it. It helped him catch some errors. I'll disclose that I've used it to help identify errors. Not serious ones, but certainly things that made me go back and edit to ensure that I wasn't overstating or saying something in a way that could be misconstrued. And to put a really fine point on this, I'm going to put into the chat a link to a class I just stumbled on. Um, serendipitously. It's a professional fact checker offering a class on fact checking using AI. And this is someone I followed a long time. I have no doubt that she's using the tool to the best of its ability. So, do you think that AI has a role to play here? And I would say from the chat, writers do not feel okay about AI being used because of its propensity to lie itself.
To be wrong.
Yeah,
Yeah. Which is not what you're looking for in a fact-checking mechanism, is
right.
for it to be wrong. I mean, right now if we use AI for anything, which Agate has a business where we produce educational content in partnership with other organizations, and some of those organizations are very interested in using AI. And we're rolling out a service now where like fact checking AI is essentially it. They're using AI for content creation. The degree to which this technology is not ready for prime time, I think, is really understated right now. Unfortunately, not enough people, I think, really grasp it, especially in C-level offices.
Mm.
But so but it's a tool, and it's something that can speed you along and get you further down the road with certain things that you're doing. Not unlike, what the web represented, 25, 30 years ago compared to traditional, sort of library work. So it might be able to get you certain way down the line, with certain things, but you're probably still going to have to check a lot of those things because it's just not good enough yet. And, you know, if the whole purpose is to catch mistakes, and we know that its degree of accuracy is already very problematic, then why would you depend on it? That's my take.
This is probably to me one of the least objectionable possible uses of AI. Like you're saying, when I began in this business, the copy editors had a library full of reference books, and that was how you did it. And it was a lot harder and slower than having the internet. And for a long time, we thought that the internet was like cheating and you had to see it in print like a true check. Uh, and if you have the ability to vet a manuscript quickly using a tool that will flag things that are potentially wrong, and then you check whether they're wrong or not in some other way, it seems almost negligent not to use that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it can get you farther down the road, faster. But you still need those 22-year-olds out there with beavering away at this. I loved what Ann said about the relative cost of a typical, immediate post BA fact checker versus an IP attorney. The former is going to be a lot less costly in terms of, the cost structure of how you're going to do any of this kind of stuff.
All right. Well, we're getting close to the end of the session. I just want to invite everyone who's with us. If you have questions for any of us, go ahead and put them into the Q&A box. I know there's been some comments about AI. There was a question earlier related to, or a query, or they wanted us to explore the plagiarism issue. I'm trying to find that now, but I think we might have covered that sufficiently. Um, oh yeah, here it is. Patty says, if readers don't see some sort of footnote, they assume the author has written the content, but what if they've plagiarized it? And sometimes I have to wonder if some of the plagiarism is more accidental than intentional. Like they did not have a great process for incorporating their sources into their work, perhaps.
Yeah, that's almost always the excuse, Jane. And if you're talking about these very, very high profile and esteemed scholars that are perpetrating this, or a high level publishing executive, there should be no ignorance of what a good process would be. And if you're talking about best-selling folks like Stephen Ambrose or Doris Kearns Goodwin, there's no shortage of resources to apply to this. Um, so I tend to feel like it's carelessness, and it's sort of like if people are saying like, well, I just had a bad process there. We took these research materials, dumped them into the manuscript, and we never really got it properly credited. That's pretty bad, I mean, that, in and of itself, that's pretty bad. But if your source for this is Wikipedia and you're essentially just sort of digesting this stuff this way, yeah, it's hard not to look at those kinds of mea culpas as, to my mind, really weak, if not bad faith altogether. But I'm a plagiarism hawk at Agate. I think plagiarism is a much simpler matter than a lot of Substack think pieces might lead you to contemplate it. It's pretty much just straight copying other people's language, ideas, what have you, there's a free commerce in ideas and things like that. But I tend to be a lot less liberal about that kind of thing when it comes to lifting people's actual words, which is what I think plagiarism is.
Yeah.
There was one thought there I wanted to go back to, if it would be all right with you.
Mhm.
When the person who asked whether fact checking would become sort of rise again as a solution to kind of AI slop, as we've come to call the shorthand. I remember listening to an interview with Sam Altman where he kind of fantasized, or like, I don't know, that he said, I can imagine in the future that things that are handmade will be even more precious. So people will be willing to spend a lot of money on, a poem made by a real person as opposed to a poem made by AI. And I recoiled at the idea that we would have this world of elite people who still had human products and everybody else was stuck with machine products. But I just felt hearing this that those human made things seemed so fragile alongside the kind of overwhelming mass of what we've seen about from the social media companies about the ways in which the powers that they have to propagate information. It would be great if people came to feel like they really needed to have solid information and they were willing to pay for it. And that would create this kind of revival in the written word and of people who are doing serious work. But it seems to me that those institutions are so fragile, and it's very hard for me to imagine us rallying around them in a way that will be enduring.
But I do think I agree with Anne about these institutions, but I do think that the desire of writers to write, for people to present their views into the world and to tell their stories is very unfragile. And
Mm.
that is going to persist. And I do think that one of the big issues with AI is really this whole question of copyright and ownership. We're still in a period, still, don't know how much longer it's going to go, where copyright is still relatively well protected. um, and again, I'm distinguishing writing from, like, sort of the excesses perpetrated by the Walt Disney Company or something like that regarding copyright and the protection of their trademarks. Um, for the time being, you can't copyright AI generated work. So much of how publishing works, so much of how information transmission works results around this idea of where did this information come from and who controls it and who owns it. So you have this, to one extent, you have this lively online commerce in information, which is sort of freely produced and distributed. But the businesses and the livelihoods that are supported by publishing come from the protection of copyright. And if you're going to have content generation from AI that is not copyrightable, it's kind of like all bets are off with that. You can just kind of constantly regenerate new copy all the time. Um, that I guess the transmission of it is going to happen in a way that is completely separate and distinct from what we've known to this point as publishing or as intellectual property businesses altogether, information journalism, so on and so forth. It's a little hard to conceive what that might look like in a post-copyright world.
Well, if it's any reassurance on the AI side, I have, and of course this could change any second, right? So, but currently AI depends a lot on recognized mainstream reputable media for sourcing. It's more likely to pull recommendations from outlets that are considered respected, generally speaking. And this was, I'll try to dig out the link. This was something that appeared in Semaphore, where it was looking at is the value of publicity going to go away for lots of reasons, but because people are trying to they're trying to get mentioned in AI or in search results, but does that really require a publicist anymore to help get you placement in certain outlets? And the conclusion was that, because AI prefers the things that people have heard of, so far you still need the publicist to get you into these places or to help create that on-ramp. Anyway, I'll look up that link and put it into the chat. Um,
If I recollect, Jane, when, with some of the revelations that have been made about these big AI companies and the kind of piracy that they did, I seem to recollect, and this is, again, my fallible recollection probably requires fact checking, that in the actions being brought against Meta in particular for their pirating a lot of copyrighted material, there have been revelations that there was internal communication at Meta, or whichever company this is that I'm almost remembering, that the material that was freely available to them on the web, freely available uncopyrighted material, wasn't good enough to produce good quality, large language model content generation. So they needed to get better material, which meant copyrighted material.
yeah.
And they needed it fast. And so they had the opportunity to go to publishers and say, let's make a deal for this. And they decided instead to pirate it. They torrented it, from illicit sources. And it goes to this question of quality, and like where quality comes from. So it's also happening in the understructure of these tools as well, which, is very big news to the readers of the bottom line, very big news to everybody in publishing, but not well appreciated by your typical high school sophomore, trying to crank out a term paper.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you remembered correctly on that. And now that these lawsuits so far, the rulings so far favor training as fair use. It'll be very interesting to see if that short circuits publishers' ability to get money for licensing their backlists or new titles.
Provided they buy a copy of every book, right? Which they
Yes.
haven't quite gotten to yet, I don't think. Yeah.
No.
But
Well, they don't seem to have made the self-interested realization that unless you are paying people in some way to produce quality, and unless you're funding the institutions that safeguard quality, the the sources of the future are going to disappear. Um, then there will be less and less for the AI to feed off of to find its information. And also it's a human decision. Somebody is setting the dials so that it favors the New York Times over, Mad Magazine or whatever its
Hmm.
decisions are. And those choices can be changed at any moment.
So there's a question that came through from Hillary, who's concerned in kind of a slant way, like if she uses AI as a tool to help her with her own fact checking or modification of the manuscript in some way, in a like a legitimate, honest process. Um, she says she's heard some publishers are scanning our documents to see if we're using AI, and is this going to cause me problems? Doug, are you scanning things with AI?
no, I don't even know really what the tech is that would enable a publisher to determine that, as far as like where it might have come from. But, certainly for something like fact checking, um, you know, like Anne was saying, I tend to think that's probably the most appropriate way to use a tool like that. It's content generation that I
Mhm.
tend to think I'm concerned about, and most other publishers are concerned about, which is to say that rather than giving me what you're representing and warranting to me that you're giving me, which is your original work, instead, the work that you are giving me is something that was produced by AI. And I see those as qualitatively different things, you know?
Yeah.
But again, I don't feel like this is one of those things like every time there's kind of a technological evolution, there needs to be sort of process and etiquette and standards that evolve around that. And I think people are kind of talking past themselves a lot right now about using AI and this was done with AI or AI was involved in this or whatever. And we're working hard to figure out, what those kind of standards should be and how they should be expressed so that everybody can understand them, which they don't right now.
Yeah,
So,
this
you have me not mentioning, I feel like you had a feature where you interviewed a bunch of editors and they did
yes.
seem to be kind of landing there, that you can use it to
Yes.
research, you can use it like even to sort of help you organize your ideas, but it can't come. Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. And I should add, though, I have received reports from writers who are very frustrated at publishers. Now, I don't think they're book publishers. I think these are more magazines and journals, are using some of the softwares that are out there that detect whether AI has been used, but it's a probabilistic thing. It's not 100% certain. And so they're getting their work rejected or they're getting dropped like a hot potato when these softwares come back with the wrong answer that it was AI generated on whatever scale is being used. So it really it frustrates me because I know that how unreliable the softwares are and any publisher using them, uh, I don't think
Yeah.
it just doesn't bode well for anyone in this
Well, we,
equation.
yeah, and Jane, like I was trying to say before, we presume good faith in this partnership that we strike with writers, and that good faith finds expression in all different manner of things. But if you as a writer bring us something and promise that you're going to be doing this and you're going to sign a contract that says that you're going to be doing this, then you're assuming a certain degree of responsibility for it. And as Anne said, a dedicated fraudster is going to find a way to work around that. So you come back to these what are effectively very human kinds of problems or issues, about this stuff that, to my mind, are relevant to this AI thing, and they're also relevant to this fact-checking thing, which is, what's up with people, you know?
I think that's a good note to end on. What's up with people?
What is it about people?
Okay. Well, we've run out of time. Doug and Anne, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss this issue. And I hope to see you all again in another session too. I really enjoyed this and hope to do it again.
It was
Thanks so
great.
much, Jane.
Thanks all. Bye bye.
Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, Doug.